Welcome back. It's good to have you.
Yeah, well, it's good to be back with this kind of notoriety. I never thought I would achieve this level of infamy, but here we are.
Well, as it happens, it seems like when people and scholars and journalists associate themselves with PragerU, they somehow find themselves on the YouTube blacklist. And in fact, our last video on anti-Semitism with Qasim Hafiz, a British Muslim, that didn't only hit the restricted list, that also got banned. So I'd say you find yourself in very good company. And, we found out a couple hours ago that YouTube restricted you, and we let you know immediately. What was your reaction when you heard that?
Well, I've spent my entire career laboring at the Wall Street Journal, and it's nice to know that when you win a Pulitzer Prize, YouTube thinks you're on a moral par with porn stars. So I feel I've achieved something.
You should feel honored. So for folks watching the video, or for folks who tried to watch the video on YouTube and were restricted from it, the video, What's Holding the Arab World Back, can you first talk about the premise that the Arab world is being held back or is lagging behind the West? By what metrics were you measuring that?
Well, I don't even think it's a particularly controversial point. Several years ago, the United Nations itself put out something called the Arab Development Report or Human Development Report, which makes the point that on one metric after another, in terms of educational attainment, in terms of social development, in terms of women's equality, in terms of economic development, the Arab world is lagging farther and farther behind. And I was amused after I wrote that column that one of the points that I made was that the Arab world has a stunted literary culture, and no one other than the Forward newspaper rebuked me with a list of great Arab novels. I've read many of those novels. Naguib Mahfouz is a wonderful novelist, the late Egyptian writer, but let's not forget that a jihadist tried to kill Naguib Mahfouz late in his life, speaking of stunted literary cultures. So I don't think the premise, quite frankly, is all that controversial, and you can look at one metric after another where the Arab world isn't where it should be.
So why is the Arab world so far behind? We hear one thing from journalists and from college professors, but for most of them, their thesis wouldn't be yours.
Well, I mean, you can sort of look at it in a number of ways, and all of them have a portion of truth. There is one issue is demography and the kind of an Arab baby boom, which created this what demographers call a youth bulge. Too many young people, not enough jobs. You can look at the theory that petrostatism leads to economic backwardness. Saudi Arabia, other countries so dependent on income from their energy exports that they create welfare states where people can be relatively well off without getting any kind of education. So at any rate, there are a number of theories, but the theory I think is most persuasive to me is that the Arab world was seized by a virulent anti-Semitism, which both is a symptom of conspiracy thinking, not a kind of a rational way of thinking about the world, but thinking of the world as a conspiracy being perpetrated against them, but also a consuming obsession, which has retarded Arab political, economic, and social development in ways that are really ultimately worst for the Arab world itself.
You opened the video with an example from the most recent Olympics in Brazil, and it was such a specific example, but it spoke volumes. Can you share that example with the audience?
Well, if you were paying attention to the Olympics, there was one particularly dismaying episode where an Israeli judoka, a judo expert named, I think, Or Sasson, had a bout. I'm not a judo expert, so I don't know if it's a bout or a match with an Egyptian by the name of Islam El-Shahabi. And after the Israeli won the match, he extended his hand to shake El-Shahabi. El-Shahabi refused the Israeli hand. And I thought that moment where the Egyptian wouldn't even extend this basic courtesy to the Israeli that had bested him kind of captured some the deeper malaise in so much of the Arab world, in which too many Egyptians and other Arabs refuse to even have a ordinary, polite human interaction, a handshake with an Israeli.
I mean, it's hard in the West, in the United States, to even identify with the idea that you wouldn't shake someone's hand, even more so an athletic opponent where it's the custom after a game to do it.
I should add, by the way, and to the credit of the Egyptians, El Shahabi was rebuked, I think, by the Egyptian Olympic Committee. I think he may have even been recalled. So I don't want to by any means say that this is symptomatic of all Egyptians or all Arabs. The point I was making is it's too symptomatic.
Mm-hmm. Has anti-Semitism done to other societies and cultures what it has done to Arab society, or is it uniquely destructive for Arab society?
No, this is a point that I learned from Paul Johnson, the great English historian, which is that this is a kind of constant in history. If you think of it, in 1492, when Columbus discovered America, the Spanish evicted the Jews from Spain. And the result, as Johnson puts it, is that Spain was deprived of a very educated members of their society, as Johnson puts it, particularly good in finance, which is something they could have used as they were beginning to conquer so much of the New World. Then you fast forward, imagine Russia. I don't know about your ancestors, but all of my ancestors fled Russia. On my father's side, my paternal great-grandparents fled the Cossacks after the Kishinev pogrom of 1903. On my mother's side, they fled from Moscow after the coming of the Bolsheviks in 1917. And the anti-Semitism, pervasive both under the Tsars and then under the Soviets, again left Russia without some of its most talented members, but also created templates for discriminatory laws which were later used against other minorities and other groups in Russia. And then the final point, Jared, is look, think of Nazi Germany. Many Jews fought proudly on the side of Germany in World War I. They considered themselves fully integrated members of German society, and they considered themselves German patriots. Then Germany got a leader in Adolf Hitler who was so virulently anti-Semitic that he ended up sending the best and brightest of Central European Jewry fleeing for its life on the eve of the Second World War. And you think of so many of the key people involved in the Manhattan Project, the creation of the American atomic bomb, so many of them, Leo Szilard, Enrico Fermi, Italian, but his wife was Jewish, Albert Einstein, of course, who first alerted Franklin Roosevelt to the possibility of an atomic bomb. All of them had been fleeing from the Nazis. If Nazi Germany, if Hitler had just been a leader in the same mold as Kaiser Wilhelm a generation before him, but hadn't been a virulent anti-Semite, Germany might have retained the scientific base in order to get the bomb first. So it was a way in which Nazi Germany ended up destroying itself through its own anti-Semitism.
It's a remarkably self-defeating hatred, and even as the tide of war turned against the Nazis, Hitler continued to invest so many resources in killing Jews, when imagine all of those resources that could have been redirected to the front lines.
Well, because killing Jews was a central aim of the Nazis.
Precisely.
And so in the mind of a committed anti-Semitic Nazi or a committed Nazi, even if they lost the war but killed all the Jews, they would have achieved something in their perverted ideology. But those are just examples of the ways in which anti-Semitism does two things. First of all, it deprives a society of a wonderfully talented minority that has contributed, that has been a benefactor in every other society that has welcomed the Jews, but also it creates a template for discrimination against minorities that leads to xenophobic and closed-minded societies. So Jews, both in terms of who the Jewish people are in themselves and what they can contribute, and secondly, what they represent about a society's broader set of values, about its commitments to tolerism, pluralism, individual rights, rights of conscience, and so on. In both those senses, one's attitude towards the Jews will be indicative of how successful that society turns out to be.
Going into a few questions in current events, so you've been one of the most prominent voices in the conservative world that has opposed Donald Trump and now President Trump. And from a foreign policy perspective, how would you grade his first 2 weeks in office?
Well, look, in the interest of fairness, let me say that I'm very pleased that we seem to be taking a tougher line on Iran. That's happening this week with a new round of sanctions. On the other hand, I think the broader gist of the foreign policy, whether it's withdrawal from the Trans-Pacific Trade Partnership and a clear signal that the United States is no longer interested in being a leader in free trade, or the totally unnecessary fight that he picked with Mexico and his attempt to humiliate the president of Mexico, or whether the equally unnecessary fight he seems to have picked with the Prime Minister of Australia, a country that has fought and bled alongside American troops since the Second World War, perhaps even, I should say, the First World War. It has not been a record of great success. And I might add, let me talk about the issue of the refugee ban and the general view of hostility to, or at least suspicion of immigrants. I think the future of the United States as a great power will depend in large part on how we address or how we define our attitude toward foreigners. Do we see immigrants and even refugees, and by the way, my mother was a refugee, as human capital, as assets, as people who can contribute to American society, or do we see them as competitors, thieves, people who are going to be culturally antagonistic to our society? And what worried me about the refugee ban, beyond the kind of the scope of the order itself, which was relatively limited, was the impression this administration has given across the board that it is not an administration that looks with favor on immigration. You heard that in President Trump's inaugural address with the Buy America, Hire American, America First themes. And I hope it doesn't define his presidency. We've had past administrations that were hostile to immigration. Think back to the 1920s, and it never served America well.
Looking at Iran, which you implied that you are pleasantly surprised, at least so far, with the White House's stance towards Iran. Yesterday or 2 days ago, they said they're putting Iran on notice about its ballistic missiles tests, and then today they announced some sanctions against companies and individuals that are connected to the nuclear program and ballistic missiles. And I think Michael Flynn came out with another very strong statement against them. Are you somewhat comforted by the fact that the White House seems to be moving to the right from where the Obama administration's position was on Iran?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. I don't think anyone was more critical of the Iran deal.
You made a video for us on it.
Yeah, well, there you go, among other things. And I must have written 5,000 columns, it seemed like, on the subject. There's no doubt that this administration is going to do things that I agree with. And I want the administration to succeed, but don't get me wrong. You know, he's now the president. We want the Trump administration to do well by America. So I'm pleased with the drift of Iran policy, but we're 2 weeks into it. Now let's see about the follow-up and the execution. Will these sanctions be the outer limit of what Trump is prepared to do, or is it the beginning? And does he have a kind of an end game And does he have the sophistication not only to start cracking down on Iranian violations of various agreements, but creating a kind of a moral coalition against Iran? And that to me seems to me highly important. Iran is a uniquely not just dangerous regime, but a vile regime towards its own people, towards many of its neighbors. You need an American leader who can also make the moral case against that regime.
A few weeks ago, when Donald Trump announced that David Friedman would be his nominee for ambassador to Israel, you wrote a column saying it's a very good decision. And then yesterday, the White House released a statement where they basically told Israel it's not helpful that you're continuing to expand settlements and build settlements. It's not helpful to the peace process. What was your reaction to that statement?
Well, I wasn't entirely surprised because I never quite bought the view of many of Trump's supporters who were also, strong pro-Israel voices, that Trump was going to be the best thing that ever happened to Israel. He started to sound a lot like the Obama administration had. Now, there are some differences because the Obama administration never seemed to make any distinction between settlements within and beyond the settlement blocks. And I'm guessing that a large number of our audience will understand these important distinctions. There are already areas, so-called settlements, areas within beyond the 67 Green Line that are clearly always going to be part of Israel. French Hill in Jerusalem, the old city in Jerusalem for that matter, other Gush Etzion and so on. And then those settlements which are somewhat more remote and unlikely to remain part of Israel and part of an overall accord. But look, my takeaway from Sean Spicer's comments is we should reserve judgment on just how pro-Israel this president, or how good for Israel this president is going to be. There's a difference between being pro-Israel and being good for Israel. Lots of people can call themselves pro-Israel, like our former president. That doesn't necessarily mean they're good for Israel.
Yeah, I'm sure you wrote this in some of your columns, and it's a thought I always had when former President Obama always said, I'm Israel's best friend. This is what friends look out for each other. I was always thinking, if this is Israel's friends, what do its enemies look like?
Well, no, I mean that's exactly it. I mean, it's the kind of friend. It's a concept of friendship in the Obama administration's imagination. The way the Obama administration thought of Israel as its drunk brother, right? That, yeah, we love you, but you're screwing up your life completely, and every decision you make is a terrible mistake, and you're sort of careening towards disaster. My basic idea of friendship is to say, or at least when it comes to Israel, is to say they probably understand their own neighborhood and know their own interests better than we do. And if anyone actually is attuned to the conversation happening inside Israel, they know how complex, sometimes divisive, and rich that conversation is. So the suggestion that Ben Rhodes or guys like that sitting in Washington understand the situation on the ground better than any Israeli politician, whether he's on the left or the right, always struck me as not only misplaced, but incredibly arrogant. Part of being empathetic, and I remember Hillary Clinton once giving a speech about the importance of empathy when it came to diplomacy, is being able to understand that a leader like the Prime Minister of Israel sees the world in a very different way than a Secretary of State at Foggy Bottom.
And I would argue part of being a friend in person to person or nation to nation is not only focusing on the faults, especially when you're telling the world about those faults. It's important to praise someone you love, and I think that's something a lot of Americans, unfortunately, who say they're pro-Israel but only criticize Israel. They don't think about that.
Yeah, well, that's exactly true. Or the Israel that they praise is an Israel that is kind of a fantasy Israel. I once heard Obama say, "Well, I like the Israel of the kibbutzim and of Moshe Dayan and Golda Meir." Well, that was an Israel that had a highly backward economy, and it was an Israel that, by the way, was a much more racist Israel than Israel is today. It was an Israel completely dominated by the Ashkenazi elite, in which the Sephardic Jews were treated as second-class citizens. It was an Israel that treated its Arab minority much worse than the Arab than Israeli Arabs are treated today. Nobody should feel all that nostalgic for that kind of Israel. People should love Israel for what it is now, a multi-ethnic, thriving, multi-sectarian, capitalistic, vivacious democracy. That's the Israel that I love. When I land in Israel and either go to Jerusalem or Tel Aviv, I'm not loving some storybook idea of Israel. I'm loving the Israel that's right before me.
And in the Israel of that Obama loves from pre-67, it was also the underdog Israel, which I think is a very key component. And they called the underdog Israel, they called those borders the Auschwitz borders, because it would have been to essentially perpetrate another Holocaust on Israel at that time would have been so much easier because it was such a weaker country.
Well, and that's exactly what even the Johnson administration recognized in 1967. And if you understand anything about, for instance, the history of Resolution 242, the UN resolution that imposed or passed right after the 67 war, it called on Israel to return territories, but not all the territories or the territories. And the U.S. ambassador to the UN at the time, Arthur Goldberg, a former Supreme Court justice, was very specific on that point, that the notion that all of the West Bank is, by definition, Palestinian territory, which is what this latest resolution passed back in December, from which the U.S. abstained, what that suggests is simply false. And those are kind of parts of the material differences which distinguished a Johnson administration from the Obama one.
And my final question for you, Bret, is so the pursuit of a two-state solution, an Israeli state next to a Palestinian state, seems like every president has tried it and every president has failed. In my opinion, it's just not attainable right now. I don't believe the Palestinians want to live side by side with Israel in peace, as a general statement. Are you concerned that the Trump administration will go down the same path of trying to forge a two-state solution and possibly push Israel into a deal that may not be good for Israel?
Well, you heard Trump during the campaign say on a number of occasions that as a great deal maker, he had the negotiating chops to succeed where how many past administrations, I think 12 past administrations had somehow failed. And that itself was one of the reasons I was not too enthusiastic about his candidacy, leaving aside so many other issues. Look, let me say something clear about the two-state solution. I am in favor of a two-state solution in theory. That is to say, if Palestine is another Costa Rica, I am totally for that.
Exactly.
Okay? Costa Rica is a small country. It has no standing army to speak of. It's been a democracy for its entire history. It is a place that welcomes foreigners, foreign capital. You know, when your relatives say they're going to vacation in Costa Rica, you probably say, "Gee, I wish I could come along." If they said we're going to go vacation in El Salvador, it might be or Honduras, it might be a different story. There's no reason why Palestinians shouldn't aspire to be the Costa Rica of the Middle East. The problem Israel has isn't with a two-state solution in theory, it's a two-state solution in practice, where the experience of Gaza has shown us that the moment settlers withdraw from Palestinian territory, what you have is, first of all, a civil war, which is what happened in Gaza in 2006 and 2007, followed by the takeover of a radical Islamist terrorist group, Hamas, followed by a succession of wars and attacks on pre-67 Israel. So I would challenge those who support a Palestinian state to say, prove to the average Israeli voter why a Palestinian state that included the West Bank would look any different from the Palestinian statelet that we now have today in Gaza. And I would challenge them further. When you say, if they were to say, well, it's ridiculous to expect them to be another Costa Rica, why is that ridiculous? What is the implicit racism in the suggestion that Palestinians could never reach the same basic standards of civility towards their neighbors and a respect for the rights of their own citizens that Costa Ricans have reached? There are all kinds of stateless people in the world. Tibetans want a state, Tamils want a state, you name it, Catalans, Scots, many people want states. Prove to me that a Palestinian state will be an asset to its own people, to its neighborhood, and to the world, and I think you're going to find not just me, but many Israelis also welcoming such a state. But if that state is going to be another Yemen, or another Iran, or another South Sudan, no thank you.
Well, it goes back to what you said in your video. Anti-Semitism is arguably the root cause behind what's holding the Arab world back, and it's the root cause behind what's holding Palestinians back. If the anti-Semitism was taken out of Palestinian society, there very likely, almost certainly, could be a viable two-state solution. And I think most Israelis do want a two-state solution, but most Israelis now, especially after Oslo, recognize that it's simply not practical. That's including most Israelis on the left, I would argue.
Look, I think that's exactly right. The tragedy we have right now is that too many Palestinians prove to too many Israelis, both on the left and the right, that a Palestinian state was a really bad idea. And that point you make about Palestinian anti-Semitism, about incitement, about the kind of a culture of wanton violence against Jews, which you see evidenced in the stabbing intifada that we just seem to have come through, or the suicide bombing intifada that I experienced when I was editor of the Jerusalem Post. The issue that has to change is an issue of Palestinian mindsets. When Palestinian TV treats Jews as subhuman creatures, when Palestinian imams constantly take out knives and show the faithful how to stab a Jew, that's the root of the problem. I wish settlements were the root of the problem. If you were to tell me, look, just get out of the settlement business and you're not going to have a conflict with the Palestinians, I would say, well, okay, fine, by all means. But the problem is not a territorial problem connected to this or that settlement. The problem is an existential problem connected to a Palestinian refusal to recognize the right of a Jewish state to exist in any territory at all. So what Secretary of State Tillerson should do, what President Trump should do, what emissary Jared Kushner, if that's the role he assumes, should do, is to press the point something fundamental has to change in the education, upbringing, outlook of too many Palestinians when it comes to this culture of anti-Semitism that pervades every aspect of their lives. If that doesn't change, we're not going to get peace, no matter if Israel withdraws every single settlement or if Israel keeps building settlements.
Well, thank you so much, Bret, for joining PragerU Live. We really appreciate it, and I do hope that by the next time we talk, YouTube has taken your video off its restricted list. And in the meantime, if for some reason your YouTube is restricted and you can't watch Bret's video, just come to our Facebook page and you'll be able to watch it.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Bret.
Is that a wrap?
Yep.
Why are so many people with so many different perspectives, from the Prime Minister of Israel to the King of Saudi Arabia, so worried that Iran might build a deliverable nuclear weapon? Or, to put it even more simply, why do we have to stop Iran from getting the bomb? The reason is painfully obvious. They might actually use it. France has nuclear weapons. So does the United Kingdom. But nobody worries that they will use them. It's not nuclear weapons that are the problem. It's who has them and what they might do with them. We do not worship Iran, we worship Allah, said Iranian leader Ayatollah Khomeini in 1980. I say, let this land burn. I say, let this land go up in smoke, provided Islam remains triumphant in the rest of the world. A militant nation that does not fear its own destruction is a sure threat to its enemies. And that threat is taken to a whole new level if the militant nation arms itself with nuclear weapons. Who are the enemies of the Islamic Republic of Iran? There are three. The first enemy of Iran is the United States of America. A common slogan chanted by Iranians at public rallies is "Death to America." But it's not just a slogan. Iran has been committing actual acts of war against what it calls the Great Satan for over 3 decades. There was Iran's seizure of the U.S. Embassy in Tehran in 1979, the 1983 bombing of the Marine barracks in Beirut that killed 241 American servicemen, and the 1996 Khobar Towers bombing in Saudi Arabia that killed another 19 Americans. Not to mention the war in Iraq, during which Iran did little to disguise the fact that it supplied anti-American militias with sophisticated, armor-piercing munitions responsible for the maiming and death of hundreds of U.S. soldiers. A nuclear Iran could greatly expand its efforts to harm American interests, secure in the knowledge that its possession of nuclear weapons would make any military retaliation extremely unlikely. And over time, and not much time, a nuclear Iran could develop the sort of intercontinental ballistic missiles that would bring American and European cities within range of its weapons. A second enemy of Iran, which is a Shiite Muslim nation, are the Sunni Muslim nations of the Middle East. An Iranian bomb would instantly spark a nuclear arms race in the region, as Arab states, nearly all of which have majority Sunni populations, move to defend themselves against aggression from Iran. As these regimes and dictatorships race to become nuclear powers, the chances that nuclear weapons might be used, either directly or through terrorist proxies, grow exponentially. And the third and ultimate enemy of Iran is Israel. Only around 1,000 miles separate the Islamic Republic from the Jewish state. Iranian leaders have called Israel a rabid dog, a cancerous tumor that needs to be cut away, and have called publicly and repeatedly for Israel's annihilation. They wage a continuous terrorist war against Israel through their proxies, Hezbollah and Hamas. Former Iranian President Akbar Hashemi Rafsanjani, a man often described as a moderate and a pragmatist in the Western press, articulated the Iranian position this way. If one day the Islamic world is also equipped with weapons like those that Israel possesses now, then the imperialist strategy will reach a standstill because the use of even one nuclear bomb inside Israel will destroy everything. However, one bomb will only harm the Islamic world. He's right. That's why the civilized and sensible leaders of the world cannot allow Iran to develop nuclear weapons. Because once the Iranians do, they will pose a severe threat to the security of America and Europe, spark a regional arms race that could see the world's worst players acquire the world's worst weapons, and threaten the Jews with extermination for the second time in a century. Or, to put it more simply, Iran cannot be allowed to get the bomb because they might actually use it. I'm Bret Stephens.
Join Prager University.
Furthermore, the United Nations' nearly 200 members seldom agree on anything. And when they do marshal a peacekeeping force, its numbers are always small, they are poorly armed and highly restricted in their use of the few weapons they do possess. They are much more likely to step aside when faced with aggression than to actively oppose it. What about dividing the world into spheres of influence? Is that really a good idea? Do we want a world where Russia gets to do what it wants toward democratic neighbors such as Latvia, and Iran dominates its region, and so on? Would such a world lead to peace or to ever more violent competition over the borders of those spheres? And of course, there's an idea that if America leaves the world alone, the world will leave America alone. If only. The Russian revolutionary Leon Trotsky once said that you may not be interested in war, but war is interested in you. Great powers don't get to take a vacation and don't get to take themselves off the terrorist target list. So, we quickly come to an inescapable conclusion. The United States is the world's policeman because there is no alternative, and everybody knows it. But what if Americans don't want the job anymore? What if the cop walked off the beat? The answer is clear and well-grounded both in history and current events. When America retreats, the bad guys advance. It's not a coincidence that after the U.S. pulled its troops out of Iraq, Islamic State exploded onto the world stage. And while it's easy to criticize America for its perceived failures in Vietnam and the first few years in Iraq, what about its obvious successes? After the Second World War ended in 1945, the Soviet Union sought to dominate the world. It failed for one reason. The United States stopped it. In 1991, we stopped Saddam Hussein and kicked him out of Kuwait. Later, we intervened to save the Balkans. As I write in my book, America in Retreat, the order the U.S. has provided has not only had enormous security benefits for all the world, it has produced phenomenal economic advantages. Global GDP, just $11 trillion in 1980, doubled by the time the Cold War ended a decade later. By 2012, it reached $72 trillion. The debate over the value of an American supervised peace, Pax Americana, should have been settled long ago. But history only settles great debates for as long as people remember the history. Many college students today could barely identify the Soviet Union, let alone explain how its plans to impose communism on nation after nation were defeated. Americans have lived in a relatively orderly world for so long that many have become complacent about maintaining it. Perhaps that explains why, in recent years, the United States has adopted a foreign policy that neglects to do the things that have made that orderly world possible. Commitments to global security, military forces adequate to meet those commitments, a willingness to intervene in regional crises to protect allies and to confront or deter aggressive regimes. If the world's leading liberal democratic nation doesn't assume its role as world policeman, the world's rogues will try to fill the breach. Then the world would be very much like it was in the 1930s, when Western self-doubt, war weariness, economic turmoil, American self-involvement, and the rise of ambitious dictatorships combined to produce unprecedented death and mayhem. Not everyone grows up wanting to be a cop, but no one wants to live in a neighborhood or a world where there is no cop. Would you? I'm Bret Stephens.
Join Prager University. Click here to subscribe to our YouTube channel. Click here to sign up.
When it comes to U.S. foreign policy, Americans must sometimes feel like Goldilocks in the Three Bears house. The porridge that was President George W. Bush's freedom agenda, promising democracy for everyone from Karachi to Casablanca, was too hot. The mush constituting President Barack Obama's foreign policy, deeply ambivalent about the uses of U.S. power, is too cold. How can the U.S. enforce basic global norms of decency, deter enemies, and reassure friends without losing sight of our national interests? There is a proven model that has nothing to do with foreign policy. It has to do with policing our toughest inner cities. In 1990, New York City had a homicide rate of more than 30 murders for every 100,000 people. By 2012, it had fallen to a rate of 5 per 100,000. A similar, if slightly less dramatic story unfolded in every other major U.S. city, despite the fact that many of the factors often cited to explain crime, bad schools, broken homes, poverty, the prevalence of guns, unemployment, remained largely the same. What happened? In 1982, George Kelling, a criminologist at Rutgers, and James Q. Wilson, a political scientist at Harvard, wrote an essay titled Broken Windows. It had long been known that if one broken window wasn't replaced, it wouldn't be long before all the other windows were broken too. Why? Because, they wrote, one unrepaired broken window is a signal that no one cares, and so breaking more windows costs nothing. Municipalities that adopted policing techniques based on the broken windows theory, the strict enforcement of laws against petty crimes and policing by foot patrols, registered sharp drops in crime and major improvements in people's quality of life. Could it be that this broken windows approach would work in our increasingly disorderly world? Absolutely. But, of course, only if the approach is applied. After the dictator of Syria, Bashar al-Assad, used sarin nerve gas to murder more than 1,000 people near Damascus in August 2013, President Obama warned that if we fail to act, the Assad regime will see no reason to stop using chemical weapons. And after Russia seized Crimea in 2014, he denounced the Kremlin for challenging truths that only a few weeks ago seemed self-evident, that in the 21st century, the borders of Europe cannot be redrawn with force. 2 broken windows, 2 eloquent warnings. Yet the warnings didn't amount to much. Bashar Assad stayed in power and continued to use chemical weapons, and Russia's invasion of Ukraine carried on. This is how we arrive at a broken windows world. Rules are invoked, but not enforced. And when rules aren't enforced, more rules will be broken. One window breaks, then others. How do we arrest the slide into a world of international disorder? As I write in my book, America in Retreat, we do it by invoking a broken windows foreign policy that sharply punishes violations of basic geopolitical norms, such as the use of chemical weapons, by swiftly and precisely targeting the perpetrators of those attacks. The emphasis should be on short, mission-specific punitive police actions, not on open-ended occupations with the goal of redeeming broken societies, as was tried in Iraq. A broken windows foreign policy doesn't try to run every bad guy out of town, nor does it demand that the U.S. put out every geopolitical fire. But it does prevent big fires, and it does punish the worst dictators. Just one cruise missile strike against just one radio tower in Rwanda during the 1994 genocide could have helped to prevent the Hutu killers from broadcasting instructions for murdering Tutsis, potentially saving tens of thousands of innocent lives and at minimal cost. Similarly, at a minimal cost to America, U.S.-led bomb strikes by NATO were decisive in lifting the siege of Sarajevo in 1995, turning the tide of war in the former Yugoslavia against Serbian dictator Slobodan Milosevic. Perhaps it is time for a strategy that enshrines the principle that preventing tragedy should enjoy greater moral legitimacy than reacting to it. I'm Bret Stephens.
To subscribe to our YouTube channel, click here.